So I guess probably the first place to begin with this is like a discussion maybe of where exactly do discussions about the existence of God play in to the whole Christian atheist dialogue, or even let's expand this a little more to include Muslims because they've been getting in on this a little more recently. Because one of the biggest complaints is this doesn't really show like any particular sort of theology is true, like any revealed religion, but at the same time, it seems like you already need to suppose the existence of God in order for one of these Abrahamic religions to be true anyway. So I'm kind of curious about your opinion on that.
Well, I mean, I think that I guess I don't understand what the question is exactly.
Yeah, I guess the question is, does God exist? Like, is it as important as we make it out to be? Because I feel that that's usually what we discuss most of the time in this, as opposed to like any particular religious theology being true. Like, is it so vital to you, or do you think that it's just a lot of wasted air?
Well, I mean, considering that the main divide, I guess the main divide between atheists and theists in general is a discussion of whether or not a God exists. I don't see that there's sufficient evidence to conclude that one does, and theists generally think that there is good enough evidence. So I think that it is an important question within the context of discussing religion and beliefs, as far as theistic religious beliefs go, I guess.
No, yeah, that's fair enough. And I'm kind of curious, if someone was to show you like a good airtight deductive argument that God did exist, would you, take any particular special revealed religion more seriously? Or do you think you'd see yourself as more like a Thomas Paine figure, someone who thinks that there's like a great architect behind everything, but, not someone who believes any particular religious revelation is true?
Well, I don't know because I haven't been presented with an airtight case for God. I think that if you were to be able to prove that at least some kind of supernatural deity exists, that would be the first step. But then you'd have to go a bit farther in order to prove any specific definition of a God.
Right. So, you want to begin there with, a particular argument and then see where it leads us?
Sure.
All right, cool. Awesome. So one argument that I really like is one that was popularized by C.S. Lewis, but it has antecedents in like a lot of medieval philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, and that's the argument from desire. And it basically runs like this. We all have what are called natural desires, and natural desires differ from non-natural desires in this way. So natural desires are desires that that nature itself gives us, that are something we're supposed to be naturally disposed to. So, for example, we all have, desires to eat, or for companionship, or desires for the good, like towards the moral truth and the moral good, and these sorts of things. And there's something external to us that satisfies these desires. So, for example, if you're hungry, then even if you're on a desert island and you can't get food, you know that there's food out there that could, in principle, satisfy these desires. So that's kind of like the first step in the argument, showing that these natural desires exist. And the second step is to say one of these desires is, not all these arguments from desire are formulated the same way, with any sort of argument, but one of these desires, I'd say, is the desire for the transcendent. And by the transcendent, I mean something which is immaterial, which goes beyond space, time, which is ultimately satisfying. It's basically the object of our mystical or spiritual endeavors. So you don't even need to be religious to affirm this. Like Sam Harris talks about, naturalistic answers to spiritual yearnings. If you look at guys like Dan Dennett, they will say, yeah, we have these, but they're explained by, a supernatural agency detection. The fact that our ancestors, if they were near a bush and it shook, and they would attribute agency to that, even if it was just the wind, because if they got out of there quickly enough, then they would survive. and if there was a predator, and if there wasn't, well, no harm, no foul. So there are these supernatural desires. Now, if we know for all these other desires that there is some sort of correspondence to it, then it seems like in this particular case, with our supernatural desires, there is a transcendent object that fulfills them, and this, well, to paraphrase Thomas Aquinas, we call God, because it seems to have a lot of those properties. It seems to be transcendent, goes beyond space and time. It's something that satisfies us beyond, our physical and material needs. And this is why you have particular religions that try to look for these things past material satisfaction. And of course, it's something which is always going to be satisfactory. Like you could always, like this is actually a criticism we make of heaven. Like when you're in heaven, how are you not going to get bored? Well, the understanding is because God is infinite and perfect, there's nothing that's possible to get bored of. So I know that's like a lot to throw at you, but just the two premises, there exist natural desires, all these, and if there exists a natural desire, this desire has an object. There exists a natural desire for something which is transcendent. Therefore, there exists something transcendent, and this we call God. So hopefully that sums it up.
Would it be correct for me to somewhat summarize it as because we desire something, therefore that something exists?
We have a natural impulse to desire something then it exists. So, for example, there are people who have who have a desire to do something like I don't know, they want a unicorn, or they might want something fictional, but that doesn't seem to be a natural desire because
how not?
All right. Well, a few reasons. One, it's not a cultural universal, whereas we seem to have religiosity or a tendency towards the mystical or the transcendent, that seems to be more or less of a cultural universal. And of course, it's something that we often try to explain using our evolutionary history. This is why you got guys like Dan Dennett going with the whole agency detection stuff going on. They're literally trying to explain some dimension of human religiosity. So I would say that those would be like an important disconnect between the two. Like a natural and non-natural.
Well, so I find the distinction between your natural and non-natural to be arbitrary. It just seems like you're claiming that something isn't natural without any good reason to suggest that it isn't natural. I think somebody having a desire for something they can't have, or a desire for something that doesn't exist, is a perfectly natural thing. I don't see how that's an unnatural thing. I think the emotion of desiring something to be a perfectly natural process that is is determined and is I guess explained by the chemical processes that happen in a complex nervous system like we have. So I guess I just don't understand that distinction. Another thing I have a problem with is how you said that one of the natural desires is a desire towards moral good, and that doesn't actually map to reality because there's obvious instances where people or other animals in the animal kingdom obviously don't have that desire, like towards moral goodness, unless you're talking about moral goodness in a more subjective way. Then I guess you can make that argument, but at the same time, I really don't think that would probably mesh with your particular position. So I guess to summarize, I don't find that there are any like transcendent desires that are not natural. So I would need some kind of other way to determine if a desire is unnatural, because it seems to me that if it naturally occurs to a person like this desire, then it is natural. Like even the desire for like a supernatural being or even eternal life, that like you could explain the desire for an eternal life as kind of like a survival mechanism, because living organisms are hardwired to survive and live, and so it just seems to me like it would be a natural desire to want to live forever in the simplest terms. I mean, I personally don't, but in the simplest terms, you could say that. As far as like the desire for some kind of supernatural thing, I think that that's more of a desire to explain our surroundings, like explain our reality. And so people do whatever they can to explain reality, because it's an uncomfortable feeling not to know something or not to be able to explain something. So at various points, it's just easy to make stuff up. Which seems to be the way of like the supernatural. Just take it out of the realm of like the discussion of God. You hear a creak in your house and you automatically think it's a ghost, so you hide underneath your covers, because obviously the covers are going to protect you against a ghost that can fly through walls. So I mean, I think that all of these desires that you think are unnatural are actually natural. It's just that you're arbitrarily stating that they're unnatural.
Right. So, all right. So let's go over a few things. One, I did kind of give a demarcation of where I think natural and unnatural desires fall in, or at least to tell. One is the fact that natural desires are culturally universal. So they appear in multiple or most, if not all, human societies. So, for example, I gave religiosity is something which is dissected from a lot of different viewpoints on a global perspective. So if you go to India, there are religious traditions there. If you go to Native American cultures, there are religious traditions there. It's pretty hard to go to some culture that doesn't have a religious tradition. Even I'm trying to remember, there's actually a very famous case where a Christian missionary went amongst natives, and they said, well, if Jesus Christ thinks it's so important, why didn't he come to us? And that eventually cascaded into a sort of atheism. I forget the name of the tribe, but apparently even they have like amneist beliefs. So we do have some sort of transcendent dimension that is captured in a lot of these societies. So cultural universality is I'd say a marker. A second one is you could actually look at the neurology of religious dispositions. In fact, there was a famous example of there's a famous example where people actually simulated religious experiences using a particular sort of electronic device, and if there is some sort of sense that can be stimulated into having it on a neurological level, if it's culturally universal, I think that it's something drastically different from the desire for a unicorn or a fictional animal or even a real thing. So
okay, sorry if I can stop you on just this one point here. Yeah. Does that not make the desire for like a deity or the supernatural, doesn't that make it natural then?
Yeah. So this kind of goes into how we demarcate between natural and supernatural. So the desire itself is natural. The object of one's desire is supernatural. And it's pretty hard to say what the difference is, but this is my understanding. Supernaturalists believe that on the fundamental aspect of reality, it's something which is a mind or mind-like. And then matter's existence is explained by it, or is grounded by it, or is caused by it. Whereas a naturalist wants to say, well, not really. Matter is at the foundation of the world, and minds, if they exist, because you have some eliminativists who deny that, or basically that there's no intentionality or aboutness. Minds themselves, if they exist, they emerge from that. So that's the distinction between the two things. I'll just go with that for the point of this discussion. Do you have any issues with that demarcation?
Well, I mean, I guess I understand a little bit better about it, but I'm still understanding it as because somebody desires it, that means it exists. And I don't see what precludes us from desiring things that don't exist.
Right. So here's a bit of a thought experiment, maybe to help us out here. So let's say that there's a secluded island, and we'll call it I don't know, we'll call it Rikers Island. I'm pretty sure that's the name of a real island, but well, it's a fictional island for the purposes of this discussion.
Well, it's an island with a prison on it, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. Awesome. So let's say that there's a fictional island, Rikers. There's no prison on it. Now that you said this, it might seem weird, but let's go with it. So there's a fictional island. Some guy is washed up on it, and he hits his head, and he remembers everything except other people. So on this island, he walks around. He eats because he has the desire to eat. While on this island, he does other things as well. So he eats. He I don't know, finds some way to sexually gratify himself because that's a desire we all have. And you know, maybe he could take care of himself on that department. Use your imaginations, folks. So any kind of natural desire he has, he might satisfy that, but he seems to long for companionship, somebody like him. Now, for all he knows, he's the only person in existence, but he kind of longs for that, and he thinks there must be somebody out there like me, and he might. And of course, he doesn't have a particular argument for it. Just because he can't explain his own existence doesn't mean that he can just posit other people. But eventually he just says, yeah, there are other people, and I can have some sort of relationship with them. And he bases that off the fact that he has all these other desires. And I'd say that if that's his line of reasoning, that he has all these other natural desires to go off of. He has a desire to eat. He finds something to satisfy that desire in the meantime. He has sexual desires. He finds something to satisfy himself in the meantime. He has all these natural desires which are appropriate to survival and to sustaining himself. Heck, he even has a desire to learn, and he studies the island and its ecosystem and habitat. And based off of all that, the fact that those things can satisfy him, he thinks, yeah, there's another person like me because I have a desire for companionship. So he goes there. And I think if this is his line of reasoning, at least by the parameters of this thought experiment, I want to say he's perfectly rational in making this inference. And if that's the case here, I don't really see a disconnect with, you know, us in a position where we know we have these religious experiences, this longing for survival, and for lifelong happiness that is never satisfied in this world, that is satisfied in something else. So I think the parallel here might help elucidate it, even if you don't agree thus far. Does that help?
Well, I guess maybe I understand a little bit better, but I feel like you're not taking into consideration the fact that humans are social animals. So if he were to have the desire to socialize with another either animal or person of his own species, I think that would just be due to the hard wiring of a social species like humans are.
Right.
I don't think that necessarily because you have the desire for it, that means that it's real. Now, while it may not be fallacious to construct that kind of syllogism, I don't think that it's very sound, because just because you desire something does not mean that something is real,
right?
You know, or that you can actually attain that particular. Because, like, I desire having a Loch Ness monster that I can ride into work, every day. That would be cool. That doesn't mean that it's either attainable or real. It just means that I have this chemical reaction in my brain that, gives me that experience of having that desire. I think also your example here ignores the fact that a human brain is complex, and we can imagine things that don't exist. Right. To suggest that we don't, it kind of it spits in the face of like science fiction altogether, really. Right. So, I think that you have to take those things into account in order to suggest that it's a sound it's sound reasoning to think, oh, I desire this, therefore it must be real.
Right. So, okay. So I think you're making your point a little more forcefully here. So, like, going back to what you said, I think it was a good insight that human beings are social animals and we're kind of hardwired for this. And I do agree, but I also think that human beings are by nature spiritual animals that desire the transcendent, and there's something there. But that's to beg the very question at hand. I can't just assert that in this dialogue here. But if that's the case, going back to our thought experiment here, where the guy on Rikers lands on the island and he hits his head and he has a concussion and he remembers no other person, he still has this longing for companionship. And if we're going to say that our desire, it would be irrational to jump from the fact that we have this desire for eternal life and God, just because we have this natural desire for it that is a cultural universal that is found in multiple societies, then I think the gentleman stranded on Rikers would also be irrational and jumping from the point that just because he has a desire for companionship, that there is actually a companion for him, or that that could in principle be satisfied. And actually, I think we're even in a more epistemically better position than he is, because at least we can cite that this is found in numerous human cultures, the idea of an afterlife, that we can study it from a neurological perspective, that anthropologists really dig into this, whereas this guy is just secluded alone, but he still has this deep desire for companionship that's just as weighty as his desire for sex or for food or for learning. So those would be a couple of the points I'd want to raise here.
Yeah, but I still don't see how, like, the even the supernatural. Let's forget his desire for companionship with another person. Right. Well, let's just say he wakes up, he doesn't remember anything, and he desires God. I like I said before, I think that him waking up and desiring some kind of all-encompassing answer to everything that he doesn't know, I think that that's more psychologically beneficial to like make that up or compensate with your lack of knowledge by making up some kind of supernatural thing that you don't understand, but you label it God. I think that has far more natural psychological benefits than it does as an indication that God exists or that or anything else like that.
Cool. So I do want to touch on that epistemic point really quickly, because that is a good thing you bring up, because human beings can even by our evolutionary development be fooled. So, for example, if we look at the world around us, like this cup is mostly made of empty space, but my perceptions don't really grasp that. Like, it looks like it's pretty full. Or another example, like in physics, if special relativity is correct, then we seem to be committed to an idea that the universe is a four-dimensional manifold, and the passage of time is somewhat illusory. And I could definitely see why people would want to give like these evolutionary answers to why we come to know the world in this perspective sense, because even if it's not like accurate on this universal scale, it's pretty cool for survival. Like, because we survive as a benefit out of this, we can consider the reason why, if we have this natural yet flawed desire, why we would have it, because of the survival benefits. And if I'm understanding you correctly, are you suggesting that this is why our religious or spiritual desires should be considered unreliable, because we have a lot of these other we have a lot of these other desires that seem to warrant skepticism, that seem to be only for survival, whereas if we want to look at the world as being true, we shouldn't base it off of this, because our evolutionary history can just care about learning just for the sake of survival rather than seeing the fundamental nature of reality. and you're worried that this might be the case here. Like, am I straw manning you, or do I have you correct?
Well, I guess I don't understand what you mean by the desire is. Sorry, I can't remember how you phrased it. You said that the desire for the supernatural is. I don't know. Can you help me out here?
No worries. I said it was a cultural universal. I said it had a neurological basis, and I said it even has like a strong evolutionary basis. Like those are some of the reasons I gave of considering it to be a natural desire rather than a non-natural desire.
Right. Well, as far as the desire like being detrimental, I think that the desire is as detrimental as any other desire, could be detrimental. I think that for a lot of people, psychologically, the desire helps them. I feel like, thinking about how, God's in control of everything. That's how a lot of people sort of explain why bad things happen to them and everything. So I think that, it's definitely psychologically beneficial for some people, but I also think that you don't have to have that desire in order to get the same kind of psychological benefits from other things. And but ultimately, my entire point with the whole desire discussion, maybe we can go on to a different argument for God, because we're kind of beating this, pretty bad. But I still don't see the connection between having a desire for something and that means that something exists.
Right.
There's a leap there that I just can't get over without some kind of evidence to connect, the desire for something to the fact that the something exists.
Right. So would you also add that there would be evolutionary advantages as well? Because, like for our ancestors, at least, if you had like a hyper agency detection and like, let's say the wind was rustling against the bush and your ancestor ran and then the next time there was a predator in the bush and the ancestor ran, just always being on the skeptical side and always sensing agency would have had that survival benefit as opposed to not. Would that be better? Because I think Michael Shermer and Dan Dennett kind of like usually use that kind of evolutionary analysis to explain the benefits for that as well.
Well, I think that the immediate benefit in that particular situation is pretty obvious, but I think in the long run, holding to this idea that something exists when it doesn't is ultimately detrimental to people, because then you can easily be fooled. A good example of this is the current pandemic, with people thinking that either the blood of Jesus is going to protect them from COVID, or that they don't need to wear a mask because apparently God is going to protect them or something like that. I feel like there's several opportunities that open up whenever you have a belief that doesn't comport with reality. If you believe that something does exist, but it doesn't really, then you're opening yourself to being exploited. You're opening yourself up to doing things that may ultimately harm you. And so I feel like that can be seen as ultimately detrimental, however immediately beneficial whatever action you're talking about is.
Right. Okay. No. All right. So those are fair concerns, and I don't want to just shift to another argument, because I'll be honest with you, I'm trying to do more research into the argument from desire, and you're actually being a really good dialogue partner here, because you're bringing up some concerns I thought I would get from atheists, non-believers, and I do thank you for it. So would you mind joining me in beating this horse a little further, because this is the one I did really come prepared for, and I do want to move on to like epistemology about this, because I think this is really where you might have a disagreement based on this. Like, this is where I think all the other disagreements are stemming from. So I'd be willing to change the conversation if you are, but I do want to just talk about this one a little more.
If you want to use our time that way, that's fine, I guess. But I really don't see how you're going to bridge that gap between desiring something that desiring something and that something existing. Like I don't know how you would bridge that gap, but I know that you need to, and I just don't see how you could provide any evidence that would bridge that gap.
Right. So this is kind of where we move on to epistemology, and how we know can often bridge the gap from one thing to another, from our premises to our conclusion. So here's where I'll start off with. And this is a position known as phenomenal conservatism. And this is a position on justification that's put forward by guys like Michael Huemer. And basically, they start off with the position of how do we know about the world? And they start off with what are called seemings. So to give you an example of what a seeming is, perhaps it's best to use a sort of optical illusion. And I'm just going to use the closest thing to me. I got a pen. I got a piece of paper, and hopefully you'll be able to see this well enough. So for those of you in the audience, can you take a guess at which one of these two lines is bigger, like in the center?
I mean, they look the exact same length to me as far as like the center line.
Yeah, so you would have been one of the people in my epistemology class who was right about this, but some people actually gather that the line at the bottom is actually longer, and that's because there's a sort of illusion there. So basically, that's kind of what a seeming is, how things just appear immediately to us. So
I've also been on the internet a while, and I've seen that particular thing like around, so that also kind of tainted my view of it.
Yeah, fair enough. And we all have seemings, like lucid dreams are a great example of seemings. Like, have you ever had a lucid dream where you're up and about and you're doing stuff, and then you wake up and like, oh, that was a dream. Like, I could have sworn I tasted stuff, I felt stuff, or things like that.
I mean, I remember having a lucid dream about being able to manipulate darts as they were being thrown, and so I was able to and I was like, "Hey, I'm having a dream," and so nice. I mean, I've had that kind of lucid dream, yeah.
Oh, so that's actually pretty cool. I've always been fooled into thinking I was awake when I was dreaming, but I've never actually like had a conscious knowledge of it. But yeah, so basically, seemings are just how the world appears to us. Now, it's not to say this is how the world is. This is just how it appears. So we start off with seemings. And then we start those off at the fundamental level. And for Huemer, his position is seemings are something you're justified in holding to unless there is overriding evidence for them. So, for example, if you were having a dream, if you were having one of these lucid dreams, and let's say it was up to the point before you started manipulating the darts, and you were just walking about like it was reality. And then you were like, oh, I'm manipulating darts. This is definitely a lucid dream. Now, it's not like you were irrational in acting and thinking that the world around you was real up until that point. But up until that point, you had what's called overriding evidence. So we do have justification to believe what the world appears to us is, in fact, how the world is, up until a point where there's overriding evidence. So I kind of gave the example earlier that before modern physics, we used to think that this was solid, whereas now we know it's mostly empty space. Now, were people irrational in thinking that it was solid? No, because they were going by their seemings, how the world appeared to them. It's not until they had overriding reasons to hold that these things were made of empty space that they had reason to believe that it wasn't the case.
Sorry to interrupt, but I feel like that's a bit of a poor example because the indication that like material things are mostly made of empty space is relatively new. So, I mean, the inclination that a solid object is solid before you're given before either humankind figured out that it was mostly empty space, or before you're of the age where you've gained that knowledge. I mean, I feel like it's a bit unfair to like call somebody irrational.
No. I'm saying they weren't irrational. No, I'm saying like people 500 years ago weren't irrational because they took the world as it appeared to them. Like that's my point.
Well, but my point is that the information that they had at the time was that, you know, that these things are solid and they're not empty space. Like that was the information that we had at the time. But now that we have better information,
Right.
I mean, knowing that like solid materials are mostly empty space, that shouldn't affect, you know, how you perceive solid materials, because you can still touch and feel it and everything like that. But I guess I'm just trying to impress the need for information about something. And I feel like that's what we're, I guess, what we're discussing here, because I think that I feel like it's wrong to hold that something is true unless you have evidence to support that claim. Right. And so I withhold like saying that something is true. Like I get what you're saying. Like, oh, I have a feeling that YouTube is suppressing, or seeming feeling. I have this unjustified feeling or seeming that YouTube is suppressing my channel, and it just because I might throw in a curse word or two or something like that. Like I don't have any empirical evidence to suggest that is true, but I have this gut feeling that it is true. Now, I can't say, oh, YouTube is doing this, because I don't have the evidence to support saying YouTube is doing this. And so I just have this gut feeling about it, but I can't say that it's true.
Right. So, this kind of goes on to other things for consideration. So you start off with seeming, but that's not, fully where you end up. So, for example, let's go with what you said about having a seeming that YouTube is unfairly or unjustifiably censoring your channel. So if that's the case, then if you do have that seeming, you also have to ask yourself about other seemings, because your beliefs, one seeming isn't like taken in isolation. So, for example, going back to not just the aspect of YouTube suppressing your channel, but also consider the fact that YouTube actually does have a way of answering back your concerns. You do have a means of dialoguing with them, asking reasons why they're acting in the way that they are. If they are going to say that they're unjustifiably censoring you, like as a conspiracy theory of some kind, and they give you reasonable answers, despite the fact that you're saying all this, then you're going past your initial seeming, and it seems like it seems at that point what you're trying to say is, okay, I had that initial seeming, and I know I'm just positing more and more ad hoc auxiliary reasons, like, oh, they're lying to me in these discussions, or all these other third persons that I'm going to who seem to side with YouTube and explain it to me, they're all in on this conspiracy. The more layers you have to add on, like the more you have to counterbalance that initial seeming. So if somebody is skeptical of what YouTube is doing, and they're just basing it off that seeming alone without looking at all the avenues they have of checking it and going through that, then yeah, I would agree that person is being irrational. But sometimes conspiracies can be justified. So I'm trying to think of the famous example in Vietnam where the Americans sunk their own ship and they used that as a pretext to go into war. So sometimes conspiracies do happen. Even that's something even Matt Dillahunty likes to point out about the whole Jesus thing. Like, oh, you believe in a conspiracy? Well, conspiracies happen. So this whole Jesus thing could have been one. Like sometimes that does happen. You can have a seeming, but don't just stop there. Like even in this example, like I have seemings of these desires as well. Like I've had religious experiences, but I don't just stop there. I look to the context of the desire itself. I look to the fact that other people seem to have one, that they very much map onto these other natural desires. So it seems like there is more empirical support, because it looks like my seemings for companionship map that out, or for sexual gratification, or for eating, or for the good. And it's because of all this stuff that I can say Yeah, it seems like the seeming gets more and more justified. Now, of course, if you'd like to point out that, well, no, that's not the case by showing that there is evidence against the position, like the disagreements among world religions, for example, then yeah, that's kind of counterbalancing it out. But at this point, we're just looking at like the overall context of our seemings. We're just looking at what our seemings lead us for and against. So,
well, I feel like you could fairly easily, in this particular argument, fall into the bullseye fallacy. You're only like, because everything that you listed off there to say that, oh, these seemings or feelings are justified. Well, I mean, you're only looking at the seemings or feelings that have like a real world component to them. You're not looking at the seemings or feelings that don't have any kind of real world component. Like I trust me, I have the desire or the seeming to instantly teleport places instead of having to drive a car. It would be so much safer. But that doesn't.
Wait, you have a seeming that you can teleport?
Well, you're using seemings. I guess the word seeming at this point. The word seeming at this point seems to be a bit has lost its meaning. I just mean going back to the whole desire discussion. Like I have the desire to teleport places. When I was a kid, I had the desire to climb walls like Spider-Man. None of these things map to reality.
Right. So, all right. So just going back, yeah. So a couple of things. This is why I kind of touch on what are these desires like and how to categorize or taxonomize them. And I don't think Spider-Man or teleportation or things like that would really count as culturally universal. Something that's massively studied in neurology or anthropology or things like that. And just to point out, while it does appear to people that we have these, there does seem to be religious experiences with something mystical or beyond us. Because that's the way the world at least appears to mystics. Like, doesn't seem like the world seems to be a way where we could teleport. At least I don't see it.
Well, okay, so I disagree that the need for teleportation or in a much more general way, these sort of supernaturally seeming actions or abilities are not universal, like culturally, because I mean, you can go to a bunch of cultures and you can see instances of like superhero or superhero tales where they have superpowers, like teleportation or climbing on walls or whatever. I mean, we have several. I mean, if you just look at the Greeks, I mean, they have superheroes all in their pantheon. You got Hercules, who's got that massive strength and everything like that. You got the one woman that's got the hair made out of snakes that can turn people into stone. I'm just saying that the need for teleportation or the need for these supernatural abilities or these superpowers isn't universal culturally. I think is not really considering the vast amounts of instances where comparable things do happen.
Right. Well, a couple of things. One, like even going to Greek folklore, like nobody wanted to be Medusa. Nobody wanted to in fact, some of these powers were considered to be a hindrance. Like King Midas, for example, the guy who could touch anything and turn it into gold. His story was considered something of something of a tragedy because he had all this amazing power to turn stuff into gold, but ultimately it fell back on him. Can I
offer a counter example of Rogue in the Marvel universe? Nobody wants the skin that can suck energy away from people. She can never touch anybody or have normal human contact ever. But also, she sucked the energy out of one particular person, and now she can fly. So, I mean, that I could see that as being somewhat similar to the Midas touch. I'm just saying that, like, while it may be detrimental, like in that regard, that still doesn't negate the fact that these particular superpowers exist in other cultures.
Right. All right. So I was just pointing that out, that these aren't universally desired. That's the only point I was bringing up. And I would also add on top of that, even if you look to how the earliest explanations for how they got their various powers, it was usually through, the supernatural, some more deep-seated desire or ability to bring it out. So even that desire seems to be rooted in something more fundamental and mystical. So I would also put that as a point as well. And even then, just putting past cultural universals too, it's not just that aspect, although that is an important part. It's also the fact that they even have their own neurological patterns that science can study, and that we try to give natural explanations for, hence hyperagency detection. So that's another point to consider as well. And another thing to keep in mind too is even you could always just because you could always explain how we stimulate these senses as well as being the explanation, but you could kind of stimulate the mind to have illusions, but that doesn't mean that your actual senses don't detect real stuff external to them. So I would point those things out as well if you want to touch on anything else.
Well, I don't know. I found myself thinking that I still don't see the connection between having the desire for something and that something existing. I know that we were wanting to talk about epistemology and
I think we are.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Epistemology just means how you know things. So, like, this is what I'm talking about.
Well, I know, but I thought that you were wanting to talk more specifically about it instead of going back to the fact that there's no evidence to connect the desire for something and that something existing. Just like with me pointing out the cultural universal supernatural powers or superhuman abilities. I don't see the fact that, I desire supernatural abilities with the idea that supernatural abilities exist. I think that you can desire things that don't exist, and that doesn't inherently mean that they do exist.
Right. I'd say it's because, I would say that I'm justified in believing that my desire for the supernatural is justified because it's a seeming that parallels my seemings for all these other natural desires, which themselves have an object. And go back to the Riker's thought experiment again. If we could imagine, let's call him Dave. Dave forgets all human beings, longs for companionship. He has the same seeming. He analogizes it to his other natural desires. And we can see why he would long for another companion, just like how we, in our particular situation, might long for the supernatural. I think if we see ourselves in a similar epistemic situation today, Dave is what I named him. Forgot my own guy's name for a moment there. But yeah, I think it is analogous, and I think if he's justified in his position, I think I'm justified in my own, all things considered.
Well, so I still feel like you're falling prey to the bullseye fallacy, because even then, when you listed off, this seeming is similar to these other seemings that I have that have real world components to them. Therefore, it's most likely true that this seeming has a real world component. I feel like it's a bullseye fallacy because you're not taking into account the seemings or feelings or desires, however you want to describe them, for things that don't exist in reality. Are you telling me that those desires just don't exist and the only desires we ever have are for things that exist in reality?
Only if they're natural desires, and only if they have the same basis that I was talking about earlier, or meet the same criteria. So I would say that, and I'd also point out that I think seemings are basically how we justify a lot of our basic beliefs. Like, for example, when it comes to the existence of other minds, I have never seen a human brain ever. Like, I've looked at photos of my own brain, but I've never actually, seen one in the skull before. And in terms of that, I'd say that even if I did, when it comes to knowing other minds exist, that you're not all just well-designed robots, I don't just go to the position that, you're robots or P-zombies. I'm like, okay, it seems like there's another mind in front of me. When he hurts or she hurts, I hurt. when they're happy, I'm happy. They're mimicking the same sort of behaviors as I am. And in that case, I see that because there's all these similarities, they seem so similar to me that they are similar to me. And I think that if I look at my desire for the supernatural and compare it to my desire for companionship, sexual gratification, eating, the pursuit of knowledge, that there is something external to it that fulfills it in the same way that it's the case for all these other things. And I think that's a fair, should I say, maybe inductive inference. By the way, I just want to say it was fun going back and forth with you. I really appreciated it.
Oh, I definitely appreciate like a good conversation, and I felt like we had a really good one. There's a lot of people out there that just want dumpster fires or to one up another person, and I hope I didn't communicate at all that.
No, you're good. You're good.
So I still, at the end of this, I still have a problem with, I guess, delineating between natural and unnatural. I don't really have a clear picture as to like what you would consider an unnatural desire. Like I think maybe an example of that might have helped me understand a little bit more of something that was unnatural. You may have said it, and I'll definitely go back and I'll re-listen in case I just happen to miss it, because this is actually the first time I've encountered an argument from desire. But I still don't see the connection between the desire for something and that something existing. I'm still failing to grasp that because it still seems like a logical leap to me. So I get that you have these other desires or seemings or feelings or whatever that do map to things in reality. But I think that the fact that they map to something in reality doesn't say anything about a future desire or some other desire that either does or doesn't map to reality. I think the mapping to reality is connected by the fact that the thing actually exists in reality and we can empirically observe it or detect it in some way. I'm not talking about like seeing God or seeing the supernatural or anything like that, but it's more of like if you come upon a pond and you see ripples emanating out from the center of this one center point, then you have a pretty good justification for saying, oh, a rock got thrown, or something, maybe not a rock, but something fell into the pond and caused the ripples. I think that we should be able to see the ripples of God in reality if he were to exist and have an effect on our reality. And I don't see that evidence in order to connect the desire to God existing.
How does this actually, out of curiosity, how does this relate to some of the other arguments for God? Like, I don't know, like I'll throw out three: teleological, cosmological, and ontological. Like, where do you rank them in front, like on that list?
Yeah. I really, I don't know. I'm not convinced by any of them. I feel like all of the arguments are bad. But I don't know. Maybe I could place the desires argument in like maybe the third spot.
All right, that's good enough.